This lecture looks at a civilization that is going to be the conduit between the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, that being the Etruscans. The Etruscans are going to be a civilization that is native and immigrant to the Italian peninsula. They settle in Tuscany between the Arno and Tiber rivers, and they will influence the ancient Greeks and be influenced by them, passing on that information by way of art, by way of architecture, their religion to the Romans when they begin taking over this area. The area that they're going to settle in is going to be seen here, these rolling hills, the fertile land, and of course a very desirable area in Italy. City by city, the Etruscans will spread out until they have a trading empire in the west. In the 6th century BCE, they will control all of northern and central Italy. Seafarers that they are going to establish trading posts and will trade with people abroad, including the Greeks in their colonies to the south, such as Syracuse and Paestum, and then of course all the way to the Greek mainland. Now, given the lack of political cohesion, like the ancient Greeks, where we find that each city-state is somewhat independent, even though they speak the same language and have the same religion, we find that in areas like Arezzo, Chiusi, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, these are all going to be ruled separately by various rulers, even though they are politically aligned. The periods of Etruscan art mirror that of ancient Greek art, moving from the geometric to the orientalizing, the archaic, and finally the classical and Hellenistic. These periods are going to be influenced by their contact with the ancient Greeks to the south. There are many Greek colonies set up on the Italian peninsula and Sicily. The style, beginning here with the orientalizing style we'll talk about, is going to be heavily indebted to their contacts with not only the Greeks but also those civilizations in Asia Minor. We know that the peninsula is wealthy by way of their mining efforts, and they have many very important metals such as iron, tin, copper, and silver that they will use to trade with peoples throughout the Mediterranean. Here we have a fibula with an orientalizing set of lions on it, meaning, of course, that they are influenced by the East, hence the term Orient meaning East. A fibula is going to be a clasp for a woman's gown, seen in areas such as here on earlier Greek sculpture. Now this is an ostentatious display of wealth. Given the size of this particular fibula, it would dwarf a woman's shoulder of the day. The work is made through granulation, or fusing metal balls or tiny granules to the metal surface by pounding them together. They also are going to be pushed out from the back as they are a hammered relief, or repoussé, just like the funerary mask we discussed at supposedly Agamemnon's tomb, discovered by Schliemann. Now the form, as you see here, is going to take these granules and then fuse them together, showing us that they are great metallurgists and that they are wealthy by way of their metals that they can mine in the area. The technique, as well as the style and subject matter, are all Eastern. The notion of using repoussé is certainly going to be learned from their contact with the Asia Minor civilizations and the Greeks. As well, the notion of showing a lion, which is not native to the Italian peninsula, we must remember, in profile here is also going to be influenced by those Near Eastern civilizations, hence the term orientalizing. The style of architecture as we move into the archaic period also mirrors that of the ancient Greeks and their temples in the south, such as the ones we already looked at, like the Temple of Hera I. Now, archaic temples, as they are going to be developed in ancient Greece, are going to have freestanding columns on all four sides. This will not be the case for the Etruscans, who build temples that are going to be largely made of materials that do not stand the test of time. Hence, we only have their stone bases, the rest of it made of terracotta, wood, and other materials that tend to rot over time. Now this departs radically from Greek models that are going to survive from the area, because we find the materials, of course, are going to be different, how they are decorated are going to be different here, as well as how we approach and appreciate the temple. With Greek temples, we should note that they have stone columns on all sides, as well as the entablature. Only the roofs are going to be made of wood and terracotta. For the Etruscans, it's all made of material that is eventually going to wash away. And so we find that only the bases survive. Now we find that the columns that are freestanding are only seen on the front of Etruscan temples. Hence there is only one approach that we can take to these structures. The Greeks designed their temples to have multiple areas of approach, to walk around the temples and see the decoration on all four sides. So even though it resembles a Greek Doric order temple, we find that the Tuscan columns that are unfluted here, made of wood, are going to have bases, which is unlike the Doric order for the Greeks. On the interior, we find there's a difference as well. The Greeks will only have one cella or naos for one god. Hence, the Temple of Hera 1 is dedicated only to the goddess Hera. For the Etruscans, their temples very often have 3 shrines, much like we see on the Minoan civilizations or the Cretans. So here we have their chief gods being Tinia or Zeus, Uni or Hera, and Minerva or Athena. These chief gods will be bequeathed to the Romans as the Capitoline Triad, and their chief deities becoming Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Hence we see how this idea of these religious figures, this pantheon, will filter through the Etruscans and then find their way into the Roman pantheon, even how they pronounce their names. On top of the roof here, we find that the Etruscans, unlike the Greeks, do not decorate the pediment and or have reliefs around an Ionic frieze or metopes or the entablature. Instead, their decorations are going to find life-size statues on the peaks of temple roofs, and they generally are made of terracotta, hence they do not survive intact. Figures such as the archaic and exuberant Apollo here, otherwise known as Apollo in the Greek and Roman traditions. We have an over life-size figure, technically, at 5 feet 11 inches tall. This is very big for an average man of the day. He exuberantly strides forward, his energy made possible and understandable to the viewer by way of the cascading folds of his drapery, his outstretched arms, his stride as he commandingly moves forward. So this is also polychromed like the ancient Greeks would have polychromed their statues, painting in many different colors to make him as lifelike as possible. Now, this is not just a statue of the god Apollo, the god of the sun. Instead, it is part of a narrative, specifically that of the labors of Heracles. Hence, the Etruscans also adopted the demigod Heracles into their pantheon. Here, the third labor of Heracles is shown, where he is asked to capture the golden stag of Artemis. This golden stag, which is a female deer, but has golden antlers and could outrun an arrow in flight, is sacred to Artemis, who's going to be Apollo's twin sister. Hence, Apollo demands the return of the beast that Heracles is going to capture. Now we find that he could not fire an arrow to bring the beast down, so he had to outrun it, and of course bring it before the council to see that he had actually succeeded in this labor. So we do not have, like in the archaic Greek statues, merely a figure that is to be understood outside of a narrative context and as a god himself. Instead, he is vigorously striding forward in motion with arms gesticulating, hands moving if they had been intact here, which is vastly different from what's happening in ancient Greece, a very stoic and, once again, a very rigid approach to their choros at the same time. We do still see remnants of the Greek style here in the archaic smile seen in the Etruscan work here for Apollo. The notion of having the figure very lifelike and moving, though, is central to understanding what the Etruscans will bequeath to their Roman counterpart. In one of the most famous works associated with the Etruscans, we have here the sarcophagus with reclining couple from Cerveteri in Italy, found in one of their tumuli tombs. Here we find that the sarcophagus is not intended to house the figures themselves, the people, the effigies that we see here, for the Etruscans are going to cremate their dead. It holds only their ashes. Yet the couple is still shown intact, and not only intact, but engaged in lively discussion as part of an activity, a narrative, which is central to the Etruscan civilization. They will always be doing something in the act of it. So even though we are still in the archaic era here, we find that they are acting as though we have moved into the late classical period in Greece. Now they are sitting on, reclining on, a banquet couch. We have a couple here, a husband and a wife, who are gesticulating and or talking while gesturing with their hands. The idea of not burying the dead, as the Greeks would have, as far as the plebes are concerned, departs from the Greek tradition. The Greeks also marked their grave sites with stele and or statues like this kouros. The Etruscans, interestingly enough, will show the effigy of the deceased even though we have ashes inside. Also, we find they are disinterested, as the Greeks are, in proportion and balance, for the legs of these figures are far too small. Their hands are large, hence they are trying to emphasize the fact that this couple is engaging with something outside of themselves, talking as part of this banquet in the afterlife. Now, only men dined at these symposia, often entertained by hetairai, or prostitutes, in the Greek culture. The Etruscans, of course, are going to celebrate the monogamous approach of marriage and will show themselves, even in the afterlife, with their wives. Note that the Greeks never show the afterlife, the underworld. It is something that is mysterious, not to be known to men who are alive. But here, not only do we see the afterlife, we also are going to be engaging with our wives and husbands in the afterlife. This is very unusual and departs greatly from the Greek understanding of death. While the Egyptians would show portraits of husbands and wives, we find that the Etruscans, showing them in the afterlife as well, are going to be much more lively and interested in this animated and lively gesticulation, as their hands are going to be moving, and this is of course emphasized in much of funerary art in ancient Etruria. Here we have another example, just to give you an alternative, in which we find couples are not only shown together in a banquet, but sometimes still embracing lovingly, in this case in a bed. The sarcophagus becomes the bed that they will hold each other with throughout all of eternity, still alive, still engaged with one another. Here we find that they even embrace, looking each other deeply in the eyes, nude underneath these sheets, of course laying on pillows. This is going to be seen in multiple examples where couples are going to be shown together, enjoying the afterlife, enjoying one another, often in a sensuous fashion. These would have been found in the types of tombs common in ancient Etruria, and those are going to be mound tombs or tumulus tombs. Plural tumuli. This necropolis is going to be built away from living cities. Hence, like the ancient Egyptians, the Etruscans understood that the dead still lived in an alternative plane of existence, an alternative space that still existed here on our plane. So they needed a place to live. They needed the same types of materials that they did while they were alive in order to still enjoy their eternal afterlife. Now, just like the Mycenaean Tholos tombs, these are going to be built up into mounds and have an interior space that is carved directly out of the rock, much like Middle Kingdom tombs in ancient Egypt. The tombs are carved away directly into the tufa bedrock here, or limestone, so it's a softer stone. So we find that the burial mounds are often built up on top, often exceeding 130 feet, for the function, as we would understand it, as a mausoleum for an entire family, not just for one individual, reflecting how they lived in family units with one structure. Here we have a detail of these tumuli in which you can enter the main doorway and see how dirt and earth is piled up on top of them. On the inside, they resemble the houses of the living, thus we can reconstruct what daily life was like in ancient Etruscan life, in which we find there are beds inset into the sides of the walls, armchairs for sitting and relaxing, footstools, windows, and various tools. The interior space looks much like Middle Kingdom tombs in ancient Egypt. Carved directly out of the bedrock, we see the beds along the walls for this multi-family home, and then the people who would be buried here in cremation urns. Notice that the pillows are carved out of the stone, as well as reliefs on the wall, including rope and various tools, machetes, axes, jugs. Everything that these individuals would need in the afterlife is included here, painted in stucco relief. Here we have another version, a photograph showing you the polychromatic forms on the walls. An amazingly detailed rendition of what an interior space would have looked like in ancient Etruria. So this is, of course, more akin to the techniques and the purpose of Egyptian tombs, where people would actually be buried in this area, and, of course, to provide for their eternal resting place and the objects they would need in the afterlife. The Greeks only made stone shrines for gods, not their dead. In another one of these tombs, a very rare example of painting survives in what is called the Tomb of the Leopards. Here in Tarquinia, in another necropolis, we have a banqueting scene. The scene is going to find men and women paired off. The men in a dark ruddy color, the women in a light yellow ochre color. And unlike the Greeks, we have men and women, not just men shown. Because in the afterlife, as with the reclining couple in the sarcophagus, people will be together with their spouses forever. The egg held by individuals, as well as the purpose of these tombs, relates to regeneration and rebirth in the afterlife, that people will continue living, celebrating with one another, and drinking. Merriment and music will be had, and this goes all the way back to ancient Sumeria in their art, where we find that exaggerated gestures and gesticulation is going to celebrate life rather than be a contemplation of death. Very similar to the Egyptians as well. The ancient Sumerians, if we remember, also showed themselves in the afterlife banqueting, drinking wine, listening to music as they are entertained. Hence we find the same type of celebration, that this must have been known to the ancient Etruscans by way of their trading with those in Asia Minor. In 509 BCE, we find the Romans are going to expel the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, founding the ancient Roman Republic. In 474 BCE, further damage will befall the Etruscan Empire in that their fleet is defeated off the coast of Cumae, where the dominance of their seafaring trade ends as we see Rome rising. At this time, not surprisingly, tomb furnishings decline, and instead of bronze and terracotta, we're going to find that we have less expensive and elaborate materials that are used. But with the rise of Rome, we find Etruscan art will be very valuable and in demand for the new civilization on the rise. Therefore, even the symbol of ancient Rome itself, seen here in the Capitoline wolf, is going to be made by an Etruscan artisan. In the archaic form and, of course, style, we have this she-wolf snarling, looking out at us, ears raised, perked up by our presence, threatened by us. We know she is a she-wolf because we have the sagging teats below her feeding the later editions of Romulus and Remus. This is a hollow cast bronze that is larger than life size. Now, the twins below are going to be added later in the 15th century by the Florentine sculptor Antonio Palladio. The story shown here is distinctly Roman and records the Roman foundation myth that fills in the gap between the fall of Troy and the founding of Rome in 753. Here we find that Aeneas, the surviving Trojan from the royal family, will found Lavinium after, of course, his wife Lavinia. His son, Ascanius, is going to found Alba Longa. Hence we find that the Romans will eventually go to war with the Albans. The sequence of kings after the founding of these two main cities is going to find that the 12th generation, 450 years later, Romulus and Remus will be born, who will found Rome as we know it, and name it after Romulus. Romulus and Remus, importantly, are abandoned as infants by their mother Rhea Silvia because the father is the god of war, Mars, and she fears that no one will believe her and that she will be put to death given that she is a priestess. We find that later, when they grow up, after being suckled by a she-wolf in the wilderness, and that's how they survive, taking into themselves the ferocity and the fighting nature and strength of a wolf, they will eventually found Rome, and then Romulus kills his twin brother Remus, becoming the sole king in 753. Now, the statue that is desired here for this new Roman Republic, the symbol of Rome that is fiercely independent, is going to be defiant and distinctly Etruscan, which is ironic. Yet we find even today on the Capitoline Hill, the Capitoline wolf here is going to be shown. She will also be on their coins, on several areas of the city carved into the stone as a symbol of ancient Rome, tying the Romans to the god of war. The taut muscles and the exuberant psychic intensity can be compared to the Apullu seen earlier on the temple. Also, the wolf looks out at the viewer, of course engaging us, just as Apullu strides forward, engaging with Heracles, demanding the golden stag back for his sister. This interactive quality will only increase as the periods mirroring Greek art move forward. That can be seen especially in the late classical Chimera of Arezzo, named for the city of Arezzo, which is another Etruscan city. We find here the story of Bellerophon and the beast that he must slay. Now, the chimera is capital C, we must add, a specific creature in ancient Greece and Greek mythology with the head of a lion, the tail of a snake, and a goat head protruding from its side. We find here that the goat's neck is wounded, hence we know that there is an implied hero present. The implied hero in this case is Bellerophon, who slays the chimera, using a lead-tipped spear that he thrusts into the beast's throat. As he breathes fire, the lead melts and he suffocates this very dangerous creature. He does so by way of riding on Pegasus. This is often going to be mistaken for the Greek hero Perseus in the myth of Medusa, but it is Bellerophon who's going to slay the chimera. The muscles are, of course, stretched over the ribcage as the beast prepares to attack, much like the earlier Capitoline wolf. We have an interactivity assumed here that the wolf and the chimera are growling, snarling at someone present. Therefore, could this have been part of a group, much like we would have had with the Gaul group, right, in Pergamon? Was there a hero standing in front with a spear? Obviously, we're in the part of the narrative where the beast is wounded, backed into a corner. The neck of the goat is bleeding. Hence, there must be some type of presence of a hero here. Or are we the hero standing in front of this beast? Have we bested it just as though we would stand over the dying Gaul? In 273 BCE, Rome succeeds in conquering the final city-states of Etruria, Veii and Cerveteri. Thus we enter the Hellenistic age of art. It is at this time that we find the Etruscans are going to retreat from their naturalistic and engaging, energetic approach to art. We find that the fall of their civilization is met with a rather somber and melancholic note, seen here in the sarcophagus of Lars Poulena. Hence, we have a life-size effigy of the deceased man in the sarcophagus. Now, however, the wife is not present. It is not joyous. He is not talking and gesticulating. Instead, he is going to lean in a recumbent pose, quietly looking out with his lips shut at the viewer. He unfurls a scroll with his life's deeds on it, telling us who he was and what he did. We find that now we are going to be focusing on transitioning to the next plane of existence, much as the Greeks understood that you would need the boatman, Charon, to move you across the river Styx into Hades. Charon, in this instance, is a spiritual guide or psychopompos. We've seen these pompoi before in earlier vase paintings, where the deceased are carried into the underworld by charons, in this case by death demons. Now, we do not see the underworld now, and it's moving into a more Greek interpretation, for these charons are going to hammer the deceased, seen here in the center, into the underworld, as other psychopompoi with wings look on to the sides. The deceased presents the scroll with his life's accomplishments on it. The head, of course, is not a true portrait, for we find many similar old age heads that are more veristic, symptomatic of economic decline, but also of the new interest of the Romans, who appreciate not youthful vigor and idealism, but age as a defining necessity for power. Moving to the aule metelle or arringatore from Cortona, we have a bronze hollow cast portrait of an Etruscan who is now going to be a Roman citizen. This is a magistrate who raises his arms to address an assembly. Hence, this was mistaken for an arringatore or orator previously, someone speaking. Now, these are going to be experts in bronze hollow casting, the Etruscans were, and so the Romans adopt their artifice and their knowledge. With his closely cropped hair and signs of aging, as his flesh sags, the nasolabial fold cuts deep into his cheeks, his brow furrows. This is going to be appreciated by the Romans for the portrait-like or veristic quality of the work. He's also dressed in a toga, similar to Roman senators. The idea of a figure, though, engaging the space in front of him goes back to the late classical era in Greece, where figures require you to walk around them, that engage with the audience in front of them. In 89 BCE, ancient Rome declares an end to the social war. Roman citizenship is then conferred on all of Italy's inhabitants, as finally everyone is considered Roman. Aule here is Etruscan, hence in name only, and Etruscan art thus becomes Roman art. The face, the dress, the haircut, and the aging all are going to be symptomatic of the rise and what Rome appreciates. Next class, we will continue with this veristic approach to portraiture with Republican portraiture and look at Roman architecture and what they adopt from the Etruscans.